Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. In this video, I'm going to show you how to cut a through wedged mortise and tenon joint. It's probably one of the strongest joints you're ever going to see, and you're going to love it. I'm Rob Cosman, and welcome to my shop. We make it our job to help take your woodworking to the next level. If you're new to our channel, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, which will alert you whenever we release a new video. Anytime we use a new tool or technique, we'll leave a description down below so that make it easier for you to find. All right, let's get back to work. I think a mortise and tenon joint is probably the most common joint in furniture construction. And its biggest downfall is you never see it. And if you do see it, it failed. A through wedged tenon, or through wedged mortise and tenon, is one way of showing off the joint, but it also increases the level of strength, I think, tremendously. I'm going to show you a few examples. First of all, I'll explain to you what it is. So this piece has the tenon, and this piece has the mortise. And typically, a mortise is nothing more than a rectangular shaped hole, hopefully the same size as the tenon. And the tenon, in this case, is going to be an extension of this piece, only it's going to be a little bit narrower and a little bit shorter so that there's a shoulder all the way around. That way, when it fits, it's nice and tight on the appearance side anyway from here. Well, instead of having a hole or a mortise in this piece that have parallel sides and ends, the sides are parallel, but the ends are flared. So if the opening is 1.5 inches on this side, it might be 1 3/4 on this side, and it's sloped. And those slopes need to be nice and straight. What you end up doing is taking this piece that has the tenon, and before you assemble it, you cut slots near the end, both ends, that come almost all the way down to the shoulder, down in here. You put it in with glue. You drive wedges that are the same shape as what would have been the void between this tenon and this now flared opening. And by driving in those two pieces, those wedges, they, along with the glue, become all one piece. In other words, this, and this all become one piece, and it fills that interior void or that interior dovetail, making a very strong joint. So here's some examples. This was just a little display, which is a take on a shaker two-step. I made it to display my DVDs when we used to do the wood show circuit. And that stretcher on the back is held in place. If it was just a regular mortise and tenon, well, you don't have a whole lot of glue surface, and it doesn't have a tremendous amount of tensile strength. So a regular mortise has a lot of shear strength pushing down like this and preventing twisting. But as far as tensile strength being pulled apart like this, it's not terribly strong. When you make it a through wedge, that adds a whole new dimension and a whole new level of strength to a regular mortise and tenon. So there's an example, and you get to show it off. So we've got maple and walnut, and although this has been around a long time and the wood has faded a little bit, you can still see it. Here's a better example. This was a walnut and ash desk that I made way back in 1988. And what you're looking at here are the sides sitting in a dado underneath, but then part of them come all the way through and they're wedged from the top side. So that gravity is constantly trying to pull that down. This makes for a very strong joint. You've got one on each corner for a total of 4. Another example, and this is a really good example of where this joint excels, is in door construction. So you have what's typically called a frame and panel door. So it's made like this so that the frame is nice and stable. The panel, which is solid wood, is able to float or expand and contract seasonally without changing or doing anything to the door. But instead of just having a typical mortise and tenon joint here, I wedged them as well. A lot of extra work, but makes for an incredibly strong joint. So those are some examples of where it's used. Now I'm going to show you I'm going to cut one apart and actually show you what it looks like from the inside, and then we're going to go through the whole process of making it. I think you're really going to enjoy this. Well, this is kind of like seeing the end of the movie at the beginning, but I'm going to show you what this actually ends up looking like. So I cut a sample joint, put some finish on it to make it stand out a little bit better, and then I cut it in half. So there's what you end up with on the inside of a through wedged mortise and tenon. Now I'm going to contrast this for a regular mortise and tenon. So here we have it. This is a rail going into a leg. So on this joint, you have glue surface, effective glue surface on that surface and on that surface, and then on that side and on that side. The end of both the ends of the mortise are end grain, so that doesn't count. The end of the tenon is end grain, so that doesn't count. So it gives you really good resistance to twisting. It gives you really good shear strength in terms of force coming down like that, but it's somewhat limited in tensile strength where something is trying to pull the joint apart. If you contrast that to a through wedge tenon, as long as you have a good glue joint between that side of the wedge and that side of the tenon, and this side of the wedge and this side of the tenon, same thing over here, this now becomes all one piece of wood. And if you look at how wide it is out here compared to how wide it is in here, in order for this joint to fail, you've got to figure out a way to pull that great big end through that little tiny opening. And the amount of force it would take to do that is going to destroy the whole piece of furniture anyway. So although there's long grain, end grain, long grain, end grain, you don't gain anything there. You do have the long grain here touching the long grain on the other side of the mortise. But the biggest advantage, of course, is that wedging effect that you get with a wider opening at the end than on the inside, and the tenon being wider in there to fill that void. So super strong joint, fun to do, and it looks great. If you get all of your lines nice and straight and gap free, it's a really decorative way to dress up a piece of woodwork with just the joinery alone. Okay, I'm going to square up the end of this piece that will be the tenon. Now, if this seems a little bit haphazard, it's simply because we're doing this as a demo as opposed to actually building a piece of furniture where we would have very careful placement of the joint. Okay, that's enough of that. Now, to lay it out, I'm going to use a pair of dividers. I'll use my sliding T-bevel. First thing we have to decide is how wide are we going to make the mortise, or the tenon, whichever way you want to refer to it as. And since this piece is going to go into this piece like so, then we can keep this as thick as possible. Remember, the joint can only be as strong as the weakest spot. So if you put a 1/4 inch tenon on there, you've reduced the thickness of a 3/4 inch piece down to a 1/4. So the 1/2 inch is my biggest mortise chisel, so that's what I'll use. I'm going to use my marking gauge to determine the length of the tenon. So if you just made it flush like that, when you bend those outside pieces with the wedge, they'd end up sinking down below the surface. So essentially what we're doing is a right angle triangle, and I can't remember the name of it, but this side is going to be longer than this one. And if I knew anything about math, I could use calculation to figure that out, but I don't, so I'm just going to guess at it. So this piece is 7/8 of an inch thick. So I'm going to set my marking gauge to be just a little bit beyond that. When I say a little bit beyond, it's probably not much more than a 32nd. Oh, I'll see if I can measure that and tell you. Where's the 30 seconds? Right here. Can't see it anyway, but it looks to be about that. So I'll use that to create a shoulder on this piece. And you want it nice and deep, because you've got to come in there and trim that back to the gauge line. So the deeper it is, the easier it is to follow if you're doing it by hand. And for me, it's just simply easier to see. All right, I'll put this in the vise. Our mortise and tenon joint is literally dictated by our chisel. So I'm going to take my mortise gauge, and I'll open that up. This is one that me and Paul, a friend of mine, designed. So the cutter backs off, allows you to put your mortise chisel between the two cutters. Then you tighten the outside one, and then you tighten this little knurled brass handle, and that squeezes the two cutters. So that now represents the width of the chisel. So I'm going to come over here, and I usually just do this one by eye, but I want to put that as close to being in the center as possible. And the easiest way to check it is to simply push it down, make a mark, and then flip it over to the other side. Now I'm way off on that one, so let's make a little adjustment. Find a different spot. That's really close, that'll do. So I'll go ahead and lay this out. Now on a typical marking gauge, the bevel causes the tool to be constantly pulled against the face of the head of the tool as you drag it through the wood like that. But on this gauge, where you have a bevel on either side, it cancels out that feature. So what you do is hold this side with my left hand and pull it in this direction. I start off by just making several light passes until I get a little bit of a line started that will hold the cutter. Just enough to be able to see. And then I'll drop down the face, or the edge I should say, and same thing over here. There. Now you can't use that to mark the mortise because this style of gauge has the bevel on the outside, and you don't want that. You need to have nice sharp lines all the way around your mortise so you get a nice tight joint. And if you use that gauge to do it, you'd end up with a bevel on that side, which would show up as a gap, which means you have to take off that much more material. So instead, I use my marking gauge to lay that out, and I'll show you how. Okay, so this, we'll just go in and identify the waist. We'll do a combination of both hand tools and power tools. Now we haven't determined the length of the tenon yet, but I'll just set that aside for a moment. Now this is where we would come in and we would be very specific on where we're going to place it, but like I said, this is just a test piece, so it doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to go in here. Which side we're going to make on the inside. We'll have this be the inside. So we'll get in here and I'm just going to leave a mark. I'm using a red pen so that we can see a little bit better. And about that wide. Actually, let's use a pair of dividers for this. It just allows us to carry it over a little bit easier. I need to have a shoulder. The joint's nice and clean on the inside based on that shoulder that you cut. It allows it to make it nice and tight. So I've got about 1/8 of an inch on either side, so I'm going to leave about the same amount on the edges. We're right about there. So I'll put that in place and leave a little mark. Now while I've got it there, I can come in here and identify that, and then I can carry it down the face. I squared up the end of my board on the shooting board so I know that when I reference my square on here, this line I'm drawing will be parallel to the outside edges. Okay, now we'll just take this, bring it over here. Where we're going to go in this direction doesn't really matter, so I'm just going to place it on there. And I would be more careful with my lines. Again, we're just doing this as for a demo. Now I'm going to carry this over. Better if I could see. And I'm going to put this line on here just so that you can follow along with what we're doing. In other words, we wouldn't normally do this. Now to make this a little more accurate, we'll use that same setting on the dividers. And we'll just connect it here. We don't have to do all of this. It's just hopefully going to help you follow along. Okay, so this is how long our mortise is going to be on the inside. Now we have to decide how long are we going to make it out here. In other words, how much slope are we going to have. Now I just do this one by eye. You want enough slope to make the joint relatively strong. Don't want too much, don't want not enough. So if we went about like that. Now the only other thing that you want to consider, and it's more aesthetic, is in looking at the joint, how you've got this rectangle, this rectangle, this rectangle, and then the two down here. So you just want to play with those and see what looks right. If you want, this is the one that's obviously going to stand out the most. So do you want that to look really wide in comparison, or do you want it to be more narrow? As long as you've got some slope there, it's going to do what you want it to do, which is hold the joint together. So I'm going to set it right about there. So I'll draw this line. And if you want, you can use your sliding T-bevel to copy that. Now, if you want to know what that angle is actually, we're sitting at about 13 degrees. And we'll carry this over onto the face. I really need my magnifiers on. This red line is not showing up as well as I would like. Okay. Now we'll decide where we're going to place it in relation to the edge. I'm going to use my marking gauge, and this is going to be the far side. I guess right there is good enough. So on this, which is going to be the show side, so I'm going to put face on here. We're going to run from the outside line to the outside line. And the nice thing about a gauge like this is you can simply roll it to get that last little bit, which makes it a lot easier to do than the traditional gauge, where as soon as you set the beam on there, it hides the pin. Now on this side, and it's really important that this edge be square with these faces so that that ends up in the same spot on the underside. This one, we're going between the two narrower lines. Now I don't need to worry about a second one because the chisel will automatically take care of that. Okay, now I'm going to identify. I'm just going to put a line, an arrow on here so that you know exactly where we're going. We're going to go all the way to that side and all the way to this one. And this pen is not cooperating. Okay, so that's the layout. All right, we're going to start chopping this on the inside. And you can do it freehand, which means you're going to chop and you've got to hold that chisel plumb. And it's got to be right on because you're going to start the process from one side and then you're going to finish it from the other, and they've got to meet in the right spot. If you want some help, what you can do is just get a block of wood, and I've squared the face to the bottom side, and I just marked that as being the bottom, and I'm going to set that on there. But before I do, I'm going to put a mark on here using my same sliding T-bevel, and I'll use this as a guide when it comes time to holding the chisel on that slope. Now, what I've got to do is put that right there and right there. You'll see how that comes into play shortly. I'm not going to use it on this first one. We're not going to go very deep. We just need to get down in there maybe 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to set that on. I've got a backup block, a piece of wood underneath, so I don't cut into my bench. And I want to have that perfectly in line with that scribe mark. Now, if you want, you can come in here and use your chisel, your marking gauge, to help hold that. I can even go back here to make it more accurate. All right, that's right on the line. Now I'll put a couple of clamps on this. So I'm going to start by simply holding the chisel, and it's nice because it's a 1/2 inch, so I've got a little more width. I'm going to hold the chisel tight to this. I'm going to stay away from that outside line initially. Hold the chisel firmly against the block and just give it a whack, and then I'll step back maybe, a little better than a 1/16 of an inch. And just make a series of shallow cuts. And what this is going to do, it's going to establish a little trough for me that'll make it easy to keep the chisel in place as we start hitting it a little harder and going a little deeper. Now I'll stay away from that outside edge until the very end. I'm going to grab a narrower mortise chisel and just come in and get rid of some of that waste. I find a narrower chisel is easier to use because then you're not squeezed between the two sides. Now when I set my chisel down in there, that little trough is going to hold it. I can hit that a little harder. And as I do, just pry back a little bit. Now, because we haven't gone all the way out to the edge, I can still pry against that without fear of wrecking something. Now we'll turn the other way and clean this out. I said 1/8 of an inch, we're down deeper than 1/8. Okay, now I'm going to turn my chisel around and I'm going to work to that edge. And I'll set this one right on the line. Doesn't really matter, but I want to be somewhat plumb. We'll go over here and do this one. I'll do this in 2 chops instead of 1. Now, I may as well just clear that stuff out. Careful on those outside edges. You take little tiny spaced chops and the pieces of wood just disintegrate. If you go too far apart, it's just too much effort, too hard to get them cleared. Now what we're going to do is flip this around. Make sure there's no debris underneath. Now this time we've got to set it up so that those guidelines match the outside edges of our mortise. Now we'll just use this to put this in place. Double check it. Okay, now clamp that. Okay, now I'm going to start at that second line and then I'll save the last bit for establishing the slope. Hold it tight against there so that you know you're going to establish a nice clean line on this outside of this close edge. Same thing as before. Bunch of little shallow chops that are only maybe 1/16 of an inch apart. And that'll give you that little trough that'll hold. Now we'll work back this way. Okay, we're all the way through. Now what we can do, I'm going to turn the chisel around. I'm going to start chopping on an angle. The whole idea is I'm working from a solid side into a void. That means the chisel is going to easily move into the void, and it makes the chiseling very simple. Now I'm just kind of eyeballing that guideline, just so that I'm in the ballpark. But now that I'm getting really close, I'm going to set the chisel right on that outside line. I got to put my headgear on. I got to be able to see this a little better. Put my chisel right on that outside line. and then simply pivot over until I'm lined up with the guideline. Get it started. Sorry. Now as you chop, you got to hold the guideline, because you want the slope of the tenon to be straight. And straight simply is the shortest distance between 2 points. Yeah, I lost it again. Go back in and pick it up. This is critical because when you drive the wedge in and it folds that outside piece over, if that slope that we're working on right now were to have a spot where I missed with my chisel and then it changed, in other words, instead of being nice and straight, it went out and then back in, well, this would come up tight down here before the gap closes up there. If it was undercut slightly, if I started too steep and then cleaned it up, well, actually, you really couldn't do that, but you don't. If it's nice and straight, when you put the wedge in, there's going to be good contact here, and you're going to secure that joint even better. Probably more than you need, but may as well have it perfect if you can do it. Okay, so I'm looking down in there, and that seems to be nice and straight. I don't see any stops and starts. One nice pass from top to bottom. And we'll go over the other side and do the same thing. So I'm free, or I'm all the way through, I should say. I'll take about half of that amount. Make sure you're tight to your guide block. Pay attention to your guide line. I'm going to do this in 2. All right, this would be the last one. Line that up. Pivot back so that you're following your guide line on the block. Light chops to get it started. Steer it if you have to keep it on your guide line. Now as you chop, it's going to want to pull forward like that because of the action of the bevel. So you're constantly having to pull back. When I've had projects where I've had numerous mortises to chop, I actually went in and made a guide block that was cut back in like this, so that I actually had a sloped wall and I could lay the chisel right against it, so I didn't have to fight with trying to move it forward and back. And the action of the chisel, as I mentioned, is constantly trying to bring it forward, so you just hold it back against that wall and just keep tapping, and it works like a charm. In this case, all I got is just a pen line, so I'm constantly having to pull back. All right, we're all the way through. Now, let's just free up some of that before that's all loose. Take the clamps off. Now I'll just poke that free. Now there's a little bit right here where obviously I got away from the edge of the guide block, but I'll just go in there and shave that off. Now if that was really bad, that would throw off my joint, because when your tenon comes up tight against this, it's going to show as a gap because of that misalignment of the mortise chisel. So I'm just going to come in here and pare that a little bit, and I'm paring from the outside toward the inside. You do it the other way, you risk breaking something off out here, and that'll show. Okay, so in inspecting this, you can take a straight edge and hold it on that slope. And if you look closely, I've got a little bit of a bump right at the bottom. So I've got to go in and fix that. On this side, it's okay. And I'm a little bit shy of coming right to the opening, but it's close enough that it's not going to be an issue. Same on that side. So we'll come in here. This is where you need to have your chisel really sharp, because you're trying to get your chisel to bite into that end grain wall. There. That's clean. I think this side is okay. Yeah, it is. All right, next move, we're going to cut the tenon to fit. So my next step is to come in and to cut this cheek. So I'm going to use my chisel, and I'm going to cut a little trough. We're going to cut the long cheeks off first. Cutting a little trough up against that gauge line. And that'll just give me a place to rest my saw and help get it started. So what I'm going to do is go to the far side. Now I'm going to put a little extra light on this. So I need to have a nice straight line across the top, down the face. So what I'm going to do is come in here, the teeth of the chisel, or the teeth of the saw are setting in that little trough up against that shoulder, and I can tell when it's touching. It's not touching there, and it is touching there. But rather than try to make a cut, starting a cut along that big long line, I'm going to tip it forward, start on the far side. All right, now I got that line created on the top, and this is a little bit of a small piece, so I'm going to actually tip it a little bit so I can see that line better. That's more than I would want. Careful not to go below your line. Now I can use that as a guide to help keep the saw tracking. And because this piece on the outside is so thin, I'm pushing against it, and what that does is just squeezes the blade between that little flap of wood and the tenon that we're keeping, and it helps to hold that blade on line. I'm watching my baseline. Don't go too low. All right, we'll do the same thing on the other side. I'm just going to go in here and cut my little trough. Okay, next thing I'm going to use my bench hook and a small joinery crosscut saw. And you can do the same thing on this as well if you want. Meaning you can go in. Now we've got to do that up against the bench dog. Go in and cut that little trough. Another reason to have a deep gauge line. This only takes half a minute or so. You really want to have a nice clean shoulder line. That's what shows on the finished joint. So we'll come in here. Crosscut teeth are different than rip. They've got sharp points, a row of them on one side and a row on the other side. So what you want to do is get in there and get that to lay right against that shoulder. Hold your saw plumb. If your saw slopes at all, it's going to show on this side. Clear that sawdust off the teeth. Now I made a few little errors that we're going to have to go in and fix, but that's all right. Give me the opportunity to show you. I'm going to go in here and take my chisel. I'm going to grab one that's a little bit wider. And I'm just going to clean that up. Finish that with that saw. I didn't saw all the way down. So I can just come in here and holding the chisel tight against the cheek. Just finish that cut. Actually went a little bit deep there. Now here's the part I was talking about. If you look on this side, I did a pretty good job of holding right on that line. But if we look over here, actually it's on this one I did. I left just a little bit of material. You have to get the camera just right in order to see it, but there's just a little bit of a ledge right there. Well, that would prevent that from sitting nice and tight against the face of the board with the mortise in it. So what I'm going to do, switch chisels yet again. Come in here, put that chisel right down there so I can feel that little ledge, and keep the chisel level. And just finish that cut, clean those corners. Check the other side. That actually wasn't as bad as I thought. I'm using a 17-degree chisel, which is fragile on hardwoods, but it does such a wonderful job in areas like this, particularly going through that end grain. Now, I actually have a little ledge right there. I can feel it. So when I pull my chisel out like this, I feel it drop down. And that little ledge that it's sitting on is what the marking gauge left. Well, that should be where my shoulder line, but it's not. I left a little bit of material above the saw, so that's where I'm going to go in and pare straight across. It's not quite as sharp as I would like. Okay. Now, we'll come in here and we'll use a combination square. And the reason is I want to be able to have a, where's my red pen? I want to be able to have the blade come right down to here. Can't do that with a regular square, but you can do it with a combination square. Now we've got some more work to do with this, but I want to teach it in such a way that it's easier to follow. I want this to stand plumb, because I've got to come in here and I've got to make these cuts. And if my board is standing plumb, it's going to be a lot easier for me to make a plumb cut, because gravity is going to teach that. I'm going to grab yet another saw. Now this cut needs to be nice and square, because this is going to show. What we're doing right now is we are cutting this end of the tenon, so if it isn't a nice straight cut, it's going to show a gap there, or this rectangle is not going to be a rectangle. It'll be sloped on one side. So I need to make sure that that is done accurately. I switched to my dovetail saw just because I have a little more control because of the size of it. Right up against that red line. And we want a nice plumb cut. Careful as you get to the bottom. You don't want to breach those shoulders. That would show on the outside. Now we're going to fit this tenon into the narrow opening first. If we were to cut those parts that are going to wedge out, then it becomes too fragile to work with. You'll see as we go through this why I say that. I'm going to turn this on its edge, on its side, pardon me. And I just line up the edge of that with that racing stripe on my bench, and I know that it's level. Cut my little chamfer against the line. Now let's stand that up. Better to leave that just a little bit short so that you don't end up breaking through this side. It's a quick fix with the chisel. Okay, do I see a little bit of debris right there? Now, we don't know if these sides are parallel to the outside face. They need to be, and this needs to be uniform thickness across its width. And we've got to make sure that we have a nice tight fit on the inside. So before we do anything with the wedge, we've got to come in here and fit this to the opening. That's a little bit tight. Flip it around and see. Now, what I really want is a perfect fit on this side, so let's try it over here. And that's pretty close. I would typically go for a little tighter fit on a through wedge tenon than I would on a regular mortise and tenon. Regular mortise and tenon, if it's too tight, all the glue gets forced to the bottom. In this case, we need to have a nice tight fit out here, so I'll sacrifice a little bit of that, which is compensated for by the wedging action. Now what I'm going to do, that's not as smooth as I would like, so I'm going to go in and I'm going to clean this up. And I just want to make sure that that surface is parallel with this one. So you don't need to use a screwdriver in here, but I like to have it a little bit more secure than what I can get with just a thumb screw. Now we want to make sure, now when we use this tool, there's a lot of force trying to pull it this way. So I have to apply a lot of extra force with my left hand, keeping that surface tight to the face of this piece with the tenon in it. That's not too bad. Let me just check a low spot. Now, because I don't know if that marking gauge was perfectly centered, or mortise gauge I should say, I'm going to reset this over here. A little thick on this side, so I'm going to come over here and reference my cutter. Okay, I won't take off any more than that. Make sure we still have our fit. Now, when we put that in there, we have a nice tight shoulder all the way around. So here's the part where you need to determine what you want in the look of your joint. And what I mean by that is, do you want this rectangle to be wider or narrower in relation to the rest of it? You have to decide that. I kind of like the proportions I have right here, so I'm going to mimic something very similar to this. So that means I'm going to put my saw cut about maybe a little more than 1/16 of an inch in from the end. Actually, I think I'll go a little bit bigger than that, right there. So leave a mark, referencing off the outside edge in both. Leave a mark. Now we'll come in and we'll square a line. Nice thing about the dividers, you just put the pen in the hole, move your square up to it, strike your line. Now over here, what we need to do, actually I'll do it on this side to make it easier to see. We need to make a sloping cut from here almost to the edge. If we make it straight down and then drive the wedge in, that's going to force this piece to break. There's a slight risk that the split will go up through here. If we do it so that it's really close, that'll be enough the wood will bend. We don't want to be too close because we don't want that piece falling off, and that just complicates the construction process because now you're looking for that little piece of wood that you don't know where it went. So I'm going to go about right there. And it doesn't really matter that they both be identical because that's not going to be seen. Okay, I'll turn this on this side so I can see it. This is another one of those cuts that has to be perfect because how square that is determines how well it's going to fit and show on the outside. So I'm going to get my light shining on, so I'm going to cut on the inside of that mark. Get that perfectly square across the end. And then do your best to follow that sloping cut from a mark. Careful not to go beyond your shoulders. It was a little bit heavy, but it'll be all right. Helps to push against that little wedge so it holds it in place and doesn't allow the saw to move side to side. And both of those are a little bit heavier than I was aiming for, but they'll bend without risking a split. Now I'm just going to clean up that fuzz on the back side. I have a piece of aspen I'm going to use for the wedge, and the reason is it's a nice contrast to the walnut. I've got it close to fitting, but I'll dress that up just a little bit once we've actually cut the wedge out. Now I want the end to be nice and square. I can cut a wedge from either side, and it's going to just cut down on the amount of work I have to do. All right, now we have to determine the length, and I'm going to make the length the same length that the tenon is, so I've got my setting that I still have on my marking gauge. And I'll scribe a line all the way around the end of this piece. Now we have to determine how wide it needs to be. So you got to wrap your head around this math. We have to fill that gap plus that saw curve and that saw curve. So we can come in here and measure this distance. This distance right here is the difference between this opening and this opening. And then to that we're going to add a saw curve, which is right about there. And if we would rather be a little fat than a little thin, but not too much, because we want that, when we assemble it, we want contact, good glue surface contact all the way down both sides of the wedge. So in from either end, we'll leave a little mark, and then square a line. Just like with everything else, this has to be square, good sharp edges in order for this to show well. Now our slope. And if we want to do this accurately, We don't want that to come to a point. We want that to come to the width of the saw kerf at the bottom. I know that's taking it to the extreme, but again, if you want to fill that the way it should, that's what we need to do. We can trim it a little bit on the shooting board. Now, put that in. More careful sawing. Just keep that square across the end. And do your best to follow that line. That might be a little heavy. We'll have to clean that up. I'm getting a little bit off, so I'm going to come back here, twist my saw just a little bit so I can alter that angle. I left that both of them a little bit heavier than I need, so I'm going to fix them. That might be easier done in a bench hook. This time we're cutting below the line, or not using that little trough method for that reason. Okay. Now I'm going to use my little bench hook and my block plane, just because the small pieces I can get the support of my fence is really close, so it's going to make this a lot easier to do. First thing we want to do is get these to fit. You don't want them too wide. You too wide, it interrupts that line. It sticks out on either side, so it's got to be just the right width. And that one actually is really good. How about this one? And that is too. They don't have to be touched that way. So the only thing we need to do then is just go in there and clean them up a little bit. And when I say clean them up, they're a little bit fat down here. If you look at the saw kerf, you look at the size of the saw kerf and then you compare that, you can see how wide it is. So this is a little bit tricky. What I need to do, I don't want to alter the thickness up here. So I'm going to start planing here, and I'll go down and go down and go down and go down, avoiding up here until my very last pass, which will go from here right to the end. And I'm up above. I don't set it down on the shooting board. I'm holding it up here just so that I can put pressure right in the middle. If you were to hold it down there, in the process of pushing in it, I find you have a tendency to plane away the top instead of the bottom. So this just gives me a little more control. So I'm starting right there. And I'll flip it over and make sure that this is staying, these surfaces are staying parallel to each other. Could use a little more blade. Compare. Okay, I'm a little fat on the top, so what I'll do is just alter where I put the pressure. That's better. Now we'll make one or two passes that go full length. Oops. Okay, that one is good. Same thing on this one. We want That's a right angle triangle, so we want the long side out here. If we put the short side out here, there's a chance that that'll end up below the surface when we tap it in. So we'll put it together like that. And the long side of this one is here, so that'll go together like that. Actually, that's just a little bit snug. I'm going to take a pass. That's better. That's the long side, and that's the long side. So it's going to go on just like that. We'll set them right there. Now, you can't put any glue on this. If you do, it's going to end up on the shoulder and on the and then you're going to have to come in here and try to clean out all in around there, which is a pain that's unneeded. Typically, I would go in and hand plane that so it's all finished, and of course the sides and the edges of this need to be hand planed before you assemble. In other words, you're trying to work into a vertical surface, and that won't happen. Put as much glue as we want in here, within reason, because it'll all come up to the surface and we can clean it off. So I'm going to go in. I like this little spatula because it allows me to very accurately place my glue. I'm putting on just a nice coat that's evenly dispersed. You've got to place glue where you want it. It's not going to find its way there on its own. And just for good measure, I'm going to coat those ramps. Now the only other thing we're going to have to glue is we have to glue the wedges, but we'll wait until we get them and just about ready to put in place. Now I need a chisel just in case I have to open up that wedge or that gap so I can get the wedge in. I'll make sure that's seated. And we'll go in here. Just push that over. Okay. Glue both sides of both surfaces of the wedge. Make sure we got the long side out. Now, as we tap these in, we want to tap them at the same rate. If you put one in farther than the other and it comes tight, then you're going to have a narrow looking wedge on one side. If we needed to, we could come in with a block and come right up against that. Now we'll take a quick peek underneath. Shoulders nice and tight all the way around. Normally we'd give that some time to dry, but we can do it right now. And I can tell by the look of the walnut that we need to be planing in this direction. Now, you might want to come in, depending on how the fit went, and put a little bit of pressure. If it's close to the edge, you can do it. If it's in the middle of the joint, you can't. But you can squeeze that if you have to. Let's clean that off and see how it looks. So there's your through wedge tenon. If you like my work, If you like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. And I've always said better tools make it a whole lot easier. If you click on the icon with the plane and the chisel, it'll take you to our website, introduce you to all of our tools, and also talk to you about our online and in-person workshops. Good luck in your woodwork.